We're less than 3 weeks away from cutdown day in the NFL. Who would be on the Seahawks roster right now if they had to name their 53 players? Rob Rang and I are going to revisit our roster projections, our last 5 in and first 5 out, and much more in a jam-packed Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Glad to be joined by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang, and a special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in on this fine Monday afternoon, whether you are in Port Townsend, Washington, or Duluth, Minnesota. We greatly appreciate each and every one of you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. The Seahawks are less than 3 weeks away from having to put together their 53-man roster. They just opened the Mike Macdonald era. I know it's an unofficial win, but it's still the first victory for Coach Macdonald in Seattle. 16-3 victory over the Chargers. We've now had a preseason game. We've had 3 weeks worth of training camp. We had OTAs. Rob, there's been plenty of time now to start assessing where this roster is at, which players would be on the team and which ones won't be. We will obviously get to our full 53-man roster projections later in the show, but it really boils down to the players that are on the bubble. That is the most important part when you're talking about roster projections. And I do think the expanded practice squads that have been in place the last few years have really changed this dynamic. You're seeing a lot fewer players that are getting plucked up by other teams because they're able to keep their own guys more readily with the 16-man practice squads. And yet still, the positions and practice squad eligibility stuff is still a big factor when teams are trying to figure out who those last 5 players in and the first 5 out are. So let's get to those last 5 in, and this will be a chance for you to dish out some of your thoughts on the game as well, because obviously the preseason opener is going to have some bearing on these bubble players.
Yeah, and a huge part of the way that these players actually performed during the game itself, it was the tipping point for me. And as you said, Corbin, the practice squad rules now have changed. It feels like a lifetime ago when teams were allowed only 5 practice squad players. Now, as you mentioned, they get 16 if they use the international pathway player. Most teams, of course, do. Some clubs may elect just to go with 15 players. That's what the regular practice squad is. The Seahawks do have an international pathway player, Max Pilcher, the offensive tackle. That's one of the players I would ultimately expect to wind up being on their practice squad. But the practice squad eligibility is now so different because of the fact that you can keep veteran players on there if they choose to stay with the team and they don't get another offer elsewhere. And so again, it's not the name practice squad for a lot of people suggests a very young player whose career is on the upswing. And, there could be a case where the Seahawks elect to keep a defensive back or a wide receiver, for example, who has a couple of years of experience in the NFL, but at the same time, is somebody who just doesn't actually make their 53-man roster for whatever case that might be. Now, I'm going to jump in here with my last 5 in, and I'm just going to rattle off the names. And these are players that were the last 5 to actually make my projected top 53 list. They included defensive lineman Miles Adams, the inside linebacker John Radigan, the defensive lineman, as well as a strong side linebacker, dropping the coverage occasionally. I was surprised to see it, Mike Morris, the cornerback / receiver / returner, D. Williams. That's probably going to be the most surprising one for a lot of folks, but because I do believe, at least in my projection here, that he is going to be the starting return man on punts, perhaps on kickoffs as well. That's why I have D. Williams making this. And then Derek Young, the wide receiver, of course, who just has such physical potential to him that I think if you try to sneak him onto the practice squad, someone's going to steal him.
Yeah, we're going to have some overlap here with our last 5 in lists. Now, Mike Morris, to me, there was no question he was on this team, especially with the fact Cameron Young is out and now Matt Goetell is out. It feels like there's not a lot of depth at that defensive line position right now beyond the top 6 or 7 guys. So all those players are going to be on the roster. But I do have Miles Adams on my last 5 in just because I did feel like going into training camp in the preseason that he was a player that was very much on the bubble, but I think the fact he can play multiple positions is going to help him make this football team. Kenny McIntosh, I've got making this team as one of my last 5 in. I have George Halani ahead of him on the depth chart right now, though. So this is very much a survival mode thing for Kenny McIntosh. I have Derek Young as well. Really impressive first preseason game, and a guy that is an excellent special teams player. Darrell Taylor is still very much on my bubble, and he has been hurt, which certainly is not going to help the situation. Now, none of the guys behind him were able to come out and have great games on Saturday. So he hasn't had any competition that's really forced the issue, but he's injured, didn't show a lot before that injury. So I'm just wondering if he's still somewhat on some tenuous ground right now for the Seahawks. And Nehemiah Pritchett, one of the Auburn corners, he is my last guy in the roster. And it's not because he's not a good football player. It's because, have you seen the corners that the Seattle Seahawks have on this roster? You can't keep 17 of them on your 53-man roster. So there's going to be some guys that are odd men out that are good football players at that spot. But I have Nehemiah Pritchett on this roster with his speed, his outside corner ability, and the fact that he could be another option if injuries strike that could return kicks down the line. Now, let's flip the script real quick, Rob. We just talked our last 5 players that make it onto the roster. There's always the flip side, the 5 players who are the first ones off the 53. And I know that there are always really difficult decisions that have to be made when you're looking at these 10 players that are squarely on the bubble.
Yeah, that's the thing is I took this in a different way than maybe you did, or maybe some of our listeners might. And as Corbin always says, thank you so much again. Thank you so much for all of your the listening and viewing. I took it as the 5 players who basically were the hardest ones to cut, that were the most difficult ones. And frankly, if I was cutting players, then I would try to tell the players who are the hardest ones that I think have a future in the NFL. You're going to be the very first ones out the door, because I do believe that you are going to have a future in the NFL, and I want to give you a head start on this mass exodus of humanity that's about to be available. So I'm going to mention 5 players here, Corbin, who I think you can make a strong argument that they should be on the Seattle's 53-man roster. And all of these players, I think, would be strong candidates to be on their practice squad as well. And then I'm going to start off with the wide receiver return man, Aesop Winston. I think that he's had a terrific camp, another strong game against the Chargers as well. Montana safety, Ty Okada, to me, is just an absolute wizard in the defensive backfield. I really like his game. Think that he is a guy that, again, could be on this roster and certainly would be a strong candidate for the practice squad as well. Montana, again, Patrick O'Connell, the linebacker, to me is just a good quality football player that I believe can be, if not a starter, then it's certainly a quality backup in the NFL. But the numbers crunch, I just go in with youth in a different way. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. And then the 2 corners that I'm very, very high on. Lance Boykin, an undrafted free agent at Coastal Carolina a year ago, was really intrigued by what I saw from him. Carlton Johnson, undrafted free agent out of Fresno State. Corbin, you mentioned Nehemiah Pritchett before, and obviously DJ James, the other corner, quote unquote, other corner from Auburn, as well, both drafted. I think that Carlton Johnson's been the best of this year's rookie cornerbacks, and so I think that you can make a strong argument again that you could rank him ahead of Nehemiah Pritchett or DJ James or D Williams, who, as I mentioned before, actually I have making this roster. But again, because of their return skills, I think that Carlton Johnson's been the best corner of this rookie class so far for the Seahawks.
Yeah, and for me, my list has a lot of different names, but there is one in particular that you and I agree on. Patrick O'Connell was the hardest player for me to cut because I do think he has improved a boatload compared to his rookie season. He had a really good OTA period. He's made some big hits in training camp as well as the preseason game, and Mike McDonald seems to like him, but I just don't know that there's going to be a spot for him there with Tyrese Knight and John Radigan being ahead of him on the depth chart. I've got both of Seattle's 6th-round picks in the offensive line on my first cuts, and this is going to be risky. Mike Jarrell is the player that I think is the biggest risk here, just because we're talking about a 95th percentile athlete at the tackle position, but I just don't know that there's going to be a spot for him. Seattle might have to take that risk and try to sneak into their practice squad. Satawa Lamea, I think, will be a little bit easier because he is not the athlete that Mike Jarrell is, and I thought he struggled quite a bit on Saturday. Hasn't really stood out in training camp. I've seen some flashes from Mike Jarrell. LeMay has been pretty quiet for most of training camp. So he's a player that I have on the outside looking in. At the receiver position, a lot of people might be thinking, where's D. Eskridge? D. Eskridge, to me, isn't even on the bubble at this point. That's just my opinion. He's been dropping passes in training camp. I just don't see a guy that's going to fit into here. Cody White, on the other hand, had an excellent block on Laviska Shenault's 44-yard kick return. He has consistently been making plays on the practice field. He's a big-bodied receiver, has a lot of special teams value, can create a little bit after the catch, has some downfield ability to high point the football. Cody White has been a guy that's been a revelation to an extent for me in this training camp. So he's another one that I've got just on the outside looking in. If they keep 7 receivers, it'll be because of special teams value, which certainly matters. And DJ James is my other player, my first 5 out. I've got Pritchett making the team. James, I thought, looked pretty good on Saturday night, but he's missed some time. And this is, again, a situation. It's more about the talent around you than the player himself. DJ James is a guy that I think they can get onto their practice squad that could still be a player that contributes on defense down the line. But I have him just on the outside looking in my projection. We're going to get diving into these 53-man projections and looking at the entire roster now. Coming up next, we'll be going on the offensive side of the football. We'll be looking at skill players as well as the offensive line. Where do Rob and I agree and where do we differ? On offense, there's actually going to be quite a few differences, so I'm looking forward to this discussion. That'll be coming up next year on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by LinkedIn Jobs. When you're hiring for your small business, you want to have as many top-tier candidates to interview as possible. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs has the tools to help find the right professionals for your team faster and for free. As a site manager for Seahawks on SI, LinkedIn Jobs is my go-to to post writing positions. I've landed some awesome candidates on my staff, and the process has been easy and seamless. LinkedIn isn't just another job board. LinkedIn has a vast network of more than 1 billion professionals, which makes it the best place to hire. Hiring is so easy that, in fact, 86% of small businesses get a qualified candidate within 24 hours. LinkedIn knows that small businesses are wearing so many hats and might not have the time or resources to hire. And LinkedIn is constantly finding ways to make the process easier. They even launched a feature that helps you write job descriptions, making the process even quicker. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Welcome back to the Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This is your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Ring. And a special thanks to all the 12s who are listening in. Thank you, as always, for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. This week, 7 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. For your second listen, make sure to check out the Locked On Fantasy Football podcast. Get your daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We just watched the Seahawks get the first victory of the Mike Macdonald era, a 16-3 win over the Chargers on the road in the first preseason game. And again, it's a preseason game. It doesn't truly count in the standings, but still going to be a memorable night for Mike Macdonald getting that first victory. And now that we've had a preseason game, we've had 3 weeks of training camp, OTAs, you name it, there's been plenty of chance to see what this football team has in terms of the best 53 players. And sometimes it isn't always about the best 53 players per se, because again, you can't keep 17 corners on your roster. And that makes, building rosters a little bit more tricky when you're talking about cut down day, which now is less than 3 weeks away. So Rob, let's get to those revised 53-man projections. And we're going to start on offense with the skill positions. And I know there were a few cuts that you made that were difficult. And there's one in particular that's going to come as a major surprise for a lot of our listeners.
Well, yeah, considering that he started in the preseason opener, that victory against the Chargers, that was damn impressive. And tight end Pharaoh Brown was a part of that. This is a big physical blocker. I think that he helps with the mindset that the Seahawks want to have. But I think that the development of Brady Russell at tight end, I think the upside that is A.J. Barner, the 4th round selection at the tight end position as well. And of course, what you have already invested in Noah Fant, I just don't see a roster spot for Pharaoh Brown. I think that, so he is somebody that I don't have making the roster at this point. I do have the undrafted rookie from Boise State, George Halani, jumping ahead of Kenny McIntosh and pushing him off the roster. I do have 6 wide receivers rather than 5 or 7. The names that you'd expect: DK, JSN, Tyler Lockett, Jake Bobo, Laviska Shenault, and then Derek Young, in that order, in my opinion, is because of the versatility that Shenault provides. No surprise at the quarterback position, although I do expect that the Seahawks will try to bring back PJ Walker on the practice squad if this scenario plays out. But I do expect them to keep 2 rather than 3 quarterbacks on the active roster, as some teams do. Otherwise, I don't know that there's a lot of surprises here. I will say that one of the hesitations I had with this skill position, that is the lack of diversity in terms of size and speed and shiftiness at the wide receiver position. I mentioned before that Aesop Winston was one of the players that was, one of the most difficult cuts in my projection here. That's because of the shiftiness that he can provide from the slot position. What I wanted D. Eskridge to perhaps provide, but we talked about him. He's not on either of my lists because I do view him as just being a cut at this point. So again, a lot of size, a lot of physicality, some straight line speed at the wide receiver position, but not a lot of guys that can make you miss. And so that's one of the things I feel like is a weakness, that if this worked out to chalk and the Seahawks followed exactly what I have here, I do think that they would be actively looking on the free agent market for small, shifty wide receivers to play that role for their offense.
I can't see the Seahawks moving on from Pharaoh Brown, but I'm going to say this in defense of you omitting him from the roster. Look, Seattle just traded one of their free agent signings in Nick Harris yesterday. Now, I understand that was because Connor Williams was signed, but look, Brady Russell has been probably the second best tight end on Seattle's roster in training camp and in the preseason, and he's an outstanding special teams player. He's not getting cut at this point. And then you've got A.J. Barner, their 4th-round pick, who is supposed to be a stout blocker and has some upside as a receiver. They're not going to cut him as a 4th-round pick. They're not going to do that. So if they're only going to have 3 tight ends on the roster, Pharaoh Brown doesn't have a ton of guaranteed money in his contract. Like, there have been moves made like this by the Seahawks in the past with free agents they signed. With that being said, I think Pharaoh Brown's blocking ability is something that they absolutely have to have with Will Dissly not being on the roster anymore. You need to have that guy that brings some chippiness, and he's made some plays in the passing game in training camp. So I don't see Seattle moving on from it. In fact, I've got the Seahawks keeping 4 tight ends and 4 running backs. And my main rationale behind this, at the running back position, George Halani and Kenny McIntosh both are plus special teams players. George Halani had a tackle the other night on kick coverage. Kenny McIntosh can return kicks. He can play kick coverage as well. And then, of course, the tight end position, Brady Russell is an outstanding special teams player. And A.J. Barner was a great special teams player at Michigan for Jay Harbaugh, who is now the special teams coach for the Seahawks. So I just don't see – I think both those positions, when you're looking at those fringe players, it all boils down to special teams. And I think at running back and tight end, the Seahawks have a good situation here where they can keep 4 at both spots, knowing that a number of those guys lower down in the depth chart are going to be cogs on special teams. So that's why I've got 4 and 4 at those 2 spots. We've got the same receivers and obviously the same quarterback. So no differentials there. Where things really change, because you had those 2 extra spots, going to the offensive line, I do think that there are some really tricky decisions that are going to have to be made here, especially when you're talking about the 2 draft picks that I mentioned earlier, Mike Jarrell as well as Satao Lamea, that I don't necessarily know that there's a spot for them right now. And then you've got a player like Stone Forsythe in the last year of his contract. Is he on this football team? There's a lot of moving parts here that I think are going to make for some interesting decisions for Mike McDonald and his coaching staff.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about the 2 tackles that you just mentioned, Stone Forsythe and Mike Jarrell. With Forsythe being the last year of his deal, I don't know. To me, he still feels like a little bit of a bargain to me, just because you know that he has actual starting reps at the left tackle position. And so I just think that's critical. That Charles Cross has taken his game, at least it appears, to a different level. And so I'm very, very excited about that. But I just think that the talented big men who can play offensive tackle in the NFL are just exceptionally rare. And so that's why I have Stone Forsythe, even though he's a player that I've certainly been critical of in the past. I have him making this roster. And Mike Jarrell, the upside, as you mentioned, the 95th percentile as an athlete. You know, he didn't do it at a small pro day. He did that at Ohio State's pro day. And so people knew about him. And the Seahawks, of course, selected him, in the 6th round, not the 7th, not as an undrafted free agent. If you cut this young man, somebody's going to pick him up just on upside alone, I believe. And so that's why I think that Mike Jarrell is pretty. I wouldn't say he's a lock at this point. That I don't know, but I still believe that that he definitely has a strong chance of making this roster over a 4th tight end or over a 4th running back. Hell, I think that you can make a case over a 7th wide receiver. And so again, I do think that the Seahawks are going to invest in their offensive line. I mean, that to me, I'll just kind of go on a detour here for just a split second about the game, because I was so impressed by the physicality that the Seahawks showed. The Chargers were the most physical team, Corbin, I saw on my little LA venture there touring training camps. And for the Seahawks to manhandle them at the line of scrimmage on both offense and defensive line, I mean, kudos to Mike McDonald and his coaching staff and the players. And I just think that the rest of the NFL saw that as well. So I think if Seattle gets too cute along the offensive or defensive lines, and there's going to be other NFL teams who are going to be stealing these players.
As far as my selections here on the offensive line, again, I did not have Jarrell. And again, I mentioned this, you just threw it out there. If there's a player that is going to get plucked up in today's practice squad era with 16-man rosters, there are so few big men that can move like that can play the tackle position. So, yes, there's a risk there. I think guard, you can sneak guys a little bit easier, a player like Satao Lamea. So I don't have him making the roster, and I don't have Mike Jarrell making the team. I think McClendon Curtis, the fact he can play both guard spots, both tackle positions, and he's only 24. There's a lot of upside there. He's a player, I think, if he gets cut, that somebody else is going to be plucking up too. So I've got Curtis making this roster. I've obviously got George Fant. He can play both tackle positions. Only 3 guards. I've got Tomlinson, Bradford, and Christian Haynes. And at this point, look, I thought Christian Haynes played really well the other night, but Anthony Bradford has gotten all of the first-team reps to this point. It just hasn't even felt like there's a competition going on there. So maybe that changes now with the way that Haynes looked the other night, but it feels like that's Anthony Bradford's job to lose at this stage. And maybe we see Laken Tomlinson get pushed by Christian Haynes at left guard here at some point. And I'm fascinated to see what happens there. But 9 offensive linemen for me. You've got 11. And maybe the key thing here, both of us have Abe Lucas being on the active roster in week 1. And we'll see where that goes. That is still a huge storyline for this team. But everything I've been told in this process, they still believe he can be ready. Does he come back this week or next week? We don't know. But this would be based on him not being on the PUP list and missing at least the first 4 games. So they're hoping that they have him available, and that's going to be a key in how they make their decisions at the tackle positions in particular. If he's not available, then Stone Forsythe or Mike Jarrell or both. You got to have those guys on the roster. When we come back, we're going to shift gears over to the defensive side of the ball. And Rob, I think you and I are more on the same tangent on a lot of things on defense, but we'll get to that here in a moment. Looking D-line, linebackers, and the secondary. That'll be coming up next year on our Monday edition of Locked On Seahawks. This episode is brought your way by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. It's what brings home the winning trophy and also keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, steering wheel covers, whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to the Locked On Seahawks podcast, Monday edition. I'm your host, Corbin Smith. Glad to be joined, as always, by my co-host in crime, Rob Rang. And a special thanks to each and every one of the 12s tuning in. Thank you for making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. We greatly appreciate it. It's time to revise our 53-man roster projections, and we look in the comments while we're doing this show. A few of you guys on there are saying, why are we doing this after one preseason game? This is more than a preseason game. At least, Rob, I know the last time we did this, a 53-man roster projection, was right after minicamp ended. So it's been more than 2 months. And so this is based on what we've seen throughout training camp and this first preseason game. I think this is a critical juncture when teams are starting to put together their 53-man roster right here when you have less than 3 weeks until cutdown day. This first preseason game and those first 3 weeks of training camp hold a lot of weight in those decisions. So let's look at the defensive side of the football now. And I want to start on the defensive line, where it doesn't feel like there's very much drama at this point in terms of who's going to be making this team. It's a very top-heavy depth chart. If you get a healthy Cameron Young back, then of course that changes things, but nothing suggests he's going to be back on the field here anytime soon. So it doesn't seem like there's a lot to debate about there. The top 6 guys or top 7 guys are going to be on this roster.
Yeah, right now it kind of feels like a question about Darrell Taylor. But as you said, otherwise, it basically comes down to is a player like a Cameron Young going to be available to the Seahawks? He is obviously a PUP candidate, but otherwise we're talking about Darrell Taylor, because you're talking along the defensive line, talking Leonard Williams, obviously Jaron Reed, Mike Morris, Jonathan Hankins, Byron Murphy, Miles Adams is a little bit of the conversation, I suppose, as well. We had that conversation a little bit earlier. I think just the positional versatility, he can line up all over the defensive line, and he's got just, again, a little bit more wiggle to him. The Seahawks have an awful lot of very big, powerful, run-defending defensive linemen. They don't have quite as many guys who have a little bit of wiggle and pass rush to them. We saw just the sheer power of Byron Murphy get flashed in that preseason victory over the Chargers. But Miles Adams, again, has power, and he's got some just kind of ability to kind of slither through gaps. And I do think that is something that is very important. So again, that I agree with you. I think that the defensive line is not a one that I'm expecting too many surprises at this point.
If Matt Gotel would not have suffered a high ankle sprain last week, I'm just going to say this right now, Matt Gotel was making this football team. All the conversations that I've had talking to other players, Matt Gotel was finally going to break through and make this football team as their second nose tackle. And that might have changed things for players like Miles Adams. But with the new kick return rules too, like Miles Adams is athletic enough that you could put him back there as a blocker. Like I would not be shocked if some of the body types are going to change there. They could keep 7 interior guys. And off the edge, as I mentioned earlier, I have Darrell Taylor on the right side of the bubble this time. I didn't in the last projection we had going into training camp. And some of it just been Nelson Caesar has not had the camp that I thought he was going to have. And he didn't have the impact in this preseason game that I thought he was going to have. It does look like this might be a player where the lack of athletic juice really does impact his ability to produce the way that he did at the college level. At least that's what it's looked like to me to this point. They just don't have anybody else that's going to be pushing for that spot. Now, could there be an edge guy that becomes available from another team at the end of camp and then they decide to move on from Darrell Taylor? Like that's not out of the question. The fact he's missed all this time in camp too certainly is looming over, but it feels like that defensive line, whether it's the interior or the edge guys, right now it's pretty well set who is going to be on this football team when the Seahawks open on September 8th. I feel pretty strong about the linebacker position as well at this point. You and I were both talking about this before the show that Patrick O'Connell is probably the toughest one to cut there just because of the improvements he's made, but it feels like a position that they're probably going to be keeping just 4.
That's the way I look at it, Corbin. I think that, again, we're talking about a little bit more of a traditional kind of 3-4 look. So you got the 2 traditional inside linebackers. And so I think that you can find those guys on the street, as sad as it is to say. I mean, that's football. Linebackers and running backs is football to me. But it's also the positions that you can find players on the street easiest, in my opinion. And so I do think that you can get away with the 4 linebackers. Of course, Terrell Dodson and Jerome Baker, the 2 free agent additions. I've been really excited about what I've seen from Dodson so far, and Baker, of course, remains to be seen with him. But I was encouraged by what I saw with Tyrese Knight on Saturday during the game against the Chargers, and certainly throughout training camp. And then Radigan just feels like the safe one. Now, I will mention this: we talked about with Cameron Young and some of the other players and the possible pup list. Drake Thomas, the undrafted free agent, who was originally with the Las Vegas Raiders. The Seahawks had him, and he was just here for a cup of coffee before suffering a big-time injury a year ago. But still, the Seahawks are very high on him, and I would love him in this defense. So he is another one that I don't know that he's going to make this roster outright because he's got to get back on the football field. But at the same time, I do think that he is somebody that would make an awful lot of sense in Mike McDonald's scheme.
If Drake Thomas was healthy, then this would be a discussion that I think, upside wise, I feel like there may be more upside there than what you've got in John Radigan. But it feels like Drake Thomas is probably one of those guys that is going to have to open the year on the PUP list because he's just not quite there yet. So you don't have to make a decision at this point on him, and you can wait it out. I mean, you can stay on the PUP list beyond the minimum 4 weeks once the regular season gets here, and you can make sure that he's healthy. And who knows where things stand. If they're struggling at linebacker and Drake Thomas is healthy, maybe they pull the switch there and try to get him in. But I'm with you here. I've got the same 4 linebackers as you. And O'Connell, like I said, he was number 1 in my first 5 out just because I really like what I've seen. But I feel like there are other position groups that it makes sense to carry an extra player more than the linebacker spot right now. Now, if Jerome Baker has hamstring issues that are still lingering, then you have to hang on to Patrick O'Connell. But this is based on the premise he's healthy for week 1 and he's ready to go. The biggest discussion point here is the cornerback spot. There's no question about it. Do you go with an all-out youth movement, or do you embrace some of the veterans like Artie Burns and Mike Jackson? Jackson, from what I've heard, it sounds like there's a chance he could be back practicing this week. Or are you going to do a little bit of a mix and match when you've got these 2 rookies out of Auburn? You've got Carlton Johnson, who's impressed. It's just such a deep position group. And then you got to add special teams into the equation. And I think for you and I, for the most part, we were seeing eye to eye here. It was just that last spot, which for you, it did boil down to special teams.
Yeah, as I mentioned before, I have D. Williams making this team just because I think that he has got a real chance of being the starting return man for the Seahawks. And so that justified including him here. As I mentioned before, one of my real bugaboos with the offensive projection I have is that I don't like the lack of size and shiftiness at wide receiver. Well, D. Williams has that receiver ability. And again, the return skills, get him in the open field the same way I think that they've tried to do with, like, say, Laviska Shenault or D. Eskridge in the past. And so, again, I think that he can be a guy that can play 3 different positions for you. So that's, kind of my argument there. It really does come down to the conversation about, veterans versus the rookies. As I mentioned before, I'm very, very high on Carlton Johnson, Lance Boykin, as well as the 2 drafted players, of course, in Nehemiah Pritchett and DJ James. I went with the veterans here because I think that this Seahawks squad, again, you had the question before, Corbin, about, why are we having this conversation now? It's only week 1. Well, for one, this is Locked On Seahawks, and we talk about what's going on every single day. And so we've already broken down the Saturday's game, and then secondly, this game I think does have some significant impact. Number one, it's going to reset the roster a little bit for the Seahawks just internally. They're going to do their own film work. Other NFL teams, of course, are going to be watching this tape as well. And they're going to see exactly what you and I have been talking about, Corbin, that this cornerback room is deep. And I think that the Seahawks recognize that. I think that they're going to be possibly having some phone calls like they did with Nick Harris, saying him to the Cleveland Browns. I think there's going to be some conversations about Seattle's cornerbacks. And can you give up a late draft pick to get a veteran or perhaps even a young cornerback? And so right now I have them going with the veterans because I think that this Seahawks squad is better than maybe some of the national pundits out there think. And so I think having a veteran secondary makes an awful lot of sense. But at the same time, I can absolutely see the argument to go with a very young secondary that Mike McDonald can make his own Legion of Boom.
I think trust is going to be the biggest aspect for Mike McDonald with his defense, because we have talked ad nauseum about the complexities of this defense and all the communication that has to happen. He seems to be incredibly comfortable with players like Artie Burns. Artie Burns has been playing a lot of snaps with the first team defense. When Devin Witherspoon goes outside, that has been the guy that's been plugged in the slot. They haven't had Trey Brown moving inside and outside. Brown plays outside in their nickel sets when Witherspoon's playing in the slot. But there seems to be a trust in Artie Burns, and he's been really good too. It's not like this is just this is a veteran, just knows what he's doing. He is playing at a really high level. So I think there's no way that they're going to be moving on from Artie Burns. I expect that he's going to be on this roster. I think Trey Brown is a lock at this point. He's had a really good camp. The question then boils down to, is Mike Jackson on this roster? Because he's got a little bit bigger salary being on a restricted free agent deal. If he's not going to be starting and he's not even going to be rotating in with some of those personnel groupings, then, is he worth that price point? Or is there a team out there like the Vikings that needs a corner that might say, hey, we'll flip a 6th or 7th to you? Those are some of the conversations that are going to have. But for me right now, I just think Nehemiah Pritchett, he's another player. Again, the special teams potential there. If you need him to return kicks, I think he would be the tougher player of the two Auburn rookies to sneak to the practice squad. Do I think they can get them both onto the practice squad? I'd be pretty confident because unlike the line positions, with the proliferation, of 7-on-7, receivers and corners at this point are a dime a dozen. Every team's got a bunch of them. So it's easier to sneak guys at those position groups. Carlton Johnson would be another one. So D. Williams, the kick return stuff, I certainly considered. But Nehemiah Pritchett, to me, is obviously the more polished corner, and that's what I was looking at here. And I think he can play plenty of special teams for the Seahawks as well. As far as the safety spots, you and I have got the same four players. Jarek Reed II not being ready to come back yet, but Kobe Bryant and Kayvon Wallace can play both safety positions, played really well the other night. Rayshon Jenkins and Julian Love can play those positions. So that's another spot it doesn't feel like at this point there's any drama. As you mentioned, maybe Ty Okada can sneak onto the roster as a special teams guy because he looked really good on Saturday night. But not a lot of drama at those positions. It feels like corner is where there could be the toughest decisions for the Seahawks to make on defense. As always, you can follow me on X and Threads at Corbin Smith NFL. You can follow Rob at Rob Rang. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you listen to your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. Coming up tomorrow, we are going to be taking a deep dive into this next week of training camp, previewing joint practices. I wish I was going to Nashville like I was supposed to, but we will be diving into what to watch when the Seahawks play in their first joint practices since 1991. Make sure you're listening in and enjoy the rest of your Monday. Go Hawks.